Wait, before you listen to this episode, I just had to tell you about our new free mini wealth building training. In this training, we're covering the first steps to building wealth, how to find your personalized wealth path, how to find and analyze deals, and then some. So don't miss out on this free training. I mean, what do you have to lose? It's free. Sign up at www.abundantculture.co/newsletter. Don't let delay get in the way of your abundant year. Now, back to the episode. Welcome back to Abundant Culture Podcast,
where we dissect the mindsets and tactics of the true beast of business.
People like Gary Vee, Grant Cardone, and Warren Buffett.
All to create a blueprint to experience life more abundantly. Hey everybody, it's Joe here. Welcome back to the Abundant Culture Podcast. We're so glad to have you back again this week. Today we're talking about leadership, but we're talking about leadership in a very specific situation. Everybody likes to talk about leadership in regards to increasing revenue or increasing profits or increasing productivity out of their employees or their team. But not anybody that I know personally talks about leadership when it comes to a grieving employee. Nobody talks about how to lead an employee who just suffered a loss in their family. Nobody likes to talk about how to lead an employee who is suffering from depression or some sort of grief because of something traumatic that has happened to them or somebody close to them. This is super important because the United States loses about approximately $75 billion every single year to lost productivity due to grieving employees. This is a widespread problem because approximately 1 in 4 people who work are struggling with grief. And think about all the lost productivity and all the joy in the workplace that is lost because somebody is struggling with something. So today we're talking to someone who wrote a book called The Dying Art of Leadership, and he talks about how to lead people who are struggling with grief. So get ready to listen to and learn from our good friend, Anthony Casablanca.
Hi, Anthony, and thank you again for coming on to the Abundant Culture Podcast. We are super excited to have you today because you're like, what you do is so important, but it's not talked about barely, like, if any at all. But before we get into the meat and potatoes of the episode, we have to ask you, what is your backstory like? How'd you even get into business?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be on the show, and it's an honor that you guys have reached out to us and contacted us to be on the show. So thank you very much for that. As far as a backstory, so I was been in business for 31 years in a whole host of leadership positions, all of them with a company called Hillenbrand, which is based here in Batesville, Indiana. I spent 28 of those years on the Batesville casket side of the business. So I have a funeral service background, but from a supply chain, from a supplier standpoint. Mm-hmm. And my brother, who's 10 years younger than I am, my brother Guy, he went to mortuary school. And so ironically, we both wound up in the death care business, which is a little strange. But he's been a funeral director since he graduated back in 1992. From my background, my whole background has been around leadership and studying leadership and practicing leadership. I spent the last 12 years of my career, 12 to 15 years of my career in senior leadership roles. So I was the vice president of human resources for Batesville Casket Company. I then went on to run their entire manufacturing and distribution organization globally. And then the last 3 years of my career, the president of Hillenbrand came knocking on my door and said, "Hey, we just acquired this company in Cincinnati, and we would really like somebody with a heart to go run this thing." And so I spent the last 3 years of my career running a company in Cincinnati as the president. And so most of my background has been in studying lean leadership, which is all about respect for people. About 3 years ago, my brother and I actually read a couple of articles on grief in the workplace, but while they were good articles and sort of made you think a little bit, they were a bit unfulfilling from the standpoint of giving advice to leaders, right? I mean, they just sort of generalized and said things like, be compassionate. Well, what does that mean, right? And so I called my brother. It's because of the way our family lives have transpired. It's just my brother and I. My dad passed away at a very young age. Our mom passed away back in 2010. And ever since she passed away, my brother and I have been talking about ways to stay connected, ways to stay close, and projects to work on. And so I called him and said, hey, I could see us combining our backgrounds, and I think we could actually make a difference in this space. There's a lot of people who are grief counselors and deal with the individual, but nobody talks to leaders about how to handle grieving employees when they're at work. And you're at work half your life, right? And you can't turn grief on and off when you get to your office. So that started the process. We kicked it around for several months, probably 6 or 7 months. And then my brother, in only the way he could say it, said, if we're going to do this, we should write a book, because everybody wants to hire the people who wrote the book. And so we put our heads together and we wrote the book separately. The book is called The Dying Art of Leadership: How Leaders Can Help Grieving Employees Excel at Work. He wrote his chapters, I wrote mine, and then we sort of pulled them together. He was in Idaho at the time. I was in Indiana. And it was actually pretty amazing about how everything came together. We really didn't have to rewrite a whole lot, which was really sort of interesting that happened. So that's how we launched the book. And then the training, the leadership training business that goes along with it, which is called Grief Leaders.
That's really awesome.
Yeah, interesting.
So have you guys had any kind of, I know both of you were in leadership positions at certain points in your career. Have you guys actually had like personal run-ins with grief within your teams and workplaces? And how did that situation kind of pan out? Well, when was the kind of describe or explain the first time where you guys actually witnessed this for yourselves? Because I feel like at some point in time in any type of leadership position, even if you're middle management or whatever the case may be, like that this subject is gonna pop up because you're dealing with so many different people, and there's so many different things out of your control. So what was that time like for you, and what I guess insight did you kind of glean from that situation?
Sure. Well, so there are like countless examples. When we wrote the book, we didn't really realize just how often we had encountered grief in the workplace. And one of the points that we really try to bring awareness to in the book and in our training classes is that grief is much larger than just the loss of a loved one. Any emotionally traumatic event that alters a person's reality can cause them to grieve. And so when you think about grief in that aspect, it becomes a lot of people are impacted when you think about it in that aspect, because now suddenly things like divorce and a significant illness diagnosis of yourself or one of your family members, right? All of those things will cause a person to grieve. So I'll give you a couple of examples. One happened very, very, very early in my career, long before we had ever thought about doing anything with the book or anything like that. I worked my way through college as a night shift dispatcher. So I worked full time. I went to school full time, supervising a group of Teamsters, all of which could have been my father, right? I mean, I was 19, 20 at the time. And these guys were all in their 30s, 40s, 50s. And the phone rang and I picked it up, and there was a voice on the other end, a very stoic voice that said, "I just killed someone." And it was one of our drivers. And, I had to balance in that moment. I had to balance several things: keeping him calm, empathizing with him, and trying to understand what really happened, and documenting an investigation, right? And so he went on to tell me what happened, all the while continuing to repeat, "I just killed someone, I just killed someone." But basically what happened was it was a rainy night. He was on a highway, and a woman came across the median and hit his truck head on. There was really nothing he could do. So calmed him down. We sent somebody up to pick him up. We sent somebody to tow the truck back. Now, this is a union organization, right? So this is Teamsters we're dealing with, not exactly the friendliest group of people in the world. And we realized that we could not put this guy back on the road, at least not right away, right? Because he was on a bid run, and he would have to go by this spot every single day on his run. So didn't really even ask the Teamsters, quite frankly. I just went to the Teamsters and said, look, here's the situation. I don't want to put this guy back out on the road. Can we swap him? We'll put the guy who stays on the dock, we'll put him out on his route, and we'll put this gentleman on the dock for at least a week while we let him sort of sort through all of these emotions. We gave him the 3 days off. This happened in the middle of the week. So we gave him like Thursday and Friday off. He came back on Monday. He was in the warehouse. Around the middle of the week, the following week, I actually called the coroner and asked him if he could shed any light on the situation. And the coroner said, look, your driver didn't kill this woman. She actually was struck by a drunk driver, which is what caused her to careen and go across the median. She died from the first impact. She was already dead when your driver collided with her. So I shared that with him. And that helped a great deal. So that was the situation, right?
Yeah.
As we've written the book, what I look back on that, and there's a couple of very important principles that played out there. Number one, we didn't let him come back to work on Thursday, right? We gave him a couple of days off. Now, he shared with me later in a private moment that he spent those 4 days he was off basically in a alcohol and drug-induced stupor. Because he couldn't really deal with what he thought had happened. We didn't ask anybody for permission, right? We immediately went to the union and said, this is what we want to do to help this individual. And we didn't, when he came to work on Monday, we didn't ask him how he was doing, right? We didn't say, hey, how you feeling? Because he was going to say, fine, I'm fine, right? And I knew he was not capable of driving that truck on Monday, but we didn't even ask him. Right? We just said, this is what we want to do. And those are some of the points that we cover in the book, right? Which is engage in the process. Don't just ask people how they're doing. They're not doing okay, right? And if they tell you fine, they're lying to you. It's probably because your culture has made it so that if somebody raises their hand and says they're struggling, it's perceived as a sign of weakness. So people tend not to share.
Yeah.
And then we put together an action plan, right? That served to help the individual. Was it a bit, did it cause some business issues? Yeah, right? The guy who was now on his route didn't really know where all of the stops were, didn't know where all of the companies were. We had to sort of guide him through some of those things over the radio on the truck and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. But at the end of the day, we were most concerned about the grieving employee, and the rest of the team did what they had to do to help. My brother had a similar experience when he owned his own business, small business. They just had, I don't know, a handful of employees, and his assistant manager started coming in late, missing work, just was distracted, not doing very well. And the other employees began to complain. And so my brother went to him and basically fired him for poor performance because he was not showing up and not calling and those kinds of things. Come to find out, what was going on with this employee was his mother was dying from cancer, and he was taking care of her. And cancer patients often go through this syndrome called Sundowners Syndrome, where they sleep during the day and they're awake all night, and they get their days and nights mixed up. And so he was staying up with her at night and then working during the day. Not exactly the way you would want to handle that situation. And actually, as we were writing the book, my brother called that individual and apologized to him and said, hey, I didn't handle this very well. Here's what I should have done. I should have sat down and talked to you and understood what was going on in your life before I reacted to the performance problem. And he accepted the apology. They're still best friends. But unfortunately, that's what happens a lot of times is unless it's something highly visible, the leader may not know that the person is struggling. It might be with depression. It might be with family members diagnosed with Alzheimer's and they're trying to figure out how to care for their father or whatever the case may be. But they do see performance indicators. And a lot of times leaders respond to the performance indicators and they start to manage the performance, which if it's not done right, can very easily create even more stress and more grief for the employee because now they're worried about keeping their job as well.
Yeah.
So those are a couple of instances that happened before we wrote the book. My brother has had another one since he's written the book that played out very, very well, where instead of reacting to the performance problem, he actually sat down with the person and said, look, I just want to talk to you. Your job's not in jeopardy, but we are concerned about you. So let's talk about what's going on. And what he learned through that conversation was heart-wrenching. You just don't know what people are dealing. It was heart-wrenching and it was very emotional and impactful. The person he talked to told him she was so thankful that now she could finally talk about the issues at work. And when my brother went back to the office after having the discussions with her, he sat down with the team and said, hey, look, we need to help this person. So there's reasons why she's coming in late or not showing up to work on a given day. There's things going on that I really can't talk about, but we need to help her. And the team was more than happy to pull together. And that person is actually now performing better than they did before they got sort of caught up in the grief. And the things he learned were amazing, right? So she had a younger brother who was tragically killed in a car accident. It was coming up on the 1-year anniversary of his death, and she was struggling with that. She had a very painful medical condition. And the reason that she was not coming into work or calling in the morning of was she would book an appointment based on the providers on her doctor's schedule. But then when a cancellation popped up, she'd jump on the appointment just to get relief and treated. She had a younger sibling who was still living at home with her parents, her mom, who was abusive. And she'd get calls in the middle of the night to go and get the sibling out of there or stop the abuse. I mean, the things this person was dealing with were overwhelming. And immediately after the discussion, the very next day, her attitude changed, her demeanor changed, her appearance changed. She was like a different person because she could talk to her boss and she knew she was going to be supported. And like I said, she's performing better now than she did before any of this took place. So that's a couple of examples.
Wow.
Those are some very interesting examples.
Yeah, I think this is something that's extremely powerful too, because I think in business so much we talk about the systems, the procedures, the P&L, the balance sheet, all the stuff that's easily quantifiable. But I feel like in business, the hardest aspect of it, the most complicated aspect that I feel like, some people never truly master, I haven't even truly mastered it yet, is that dealing with the people aspect of it.
Right.
And I think there's a lot of people out there who are managers or business owners who would see a dip in performance and react based off of that and not ask the important questions of, I've noticed something's been a little bit different about you. Let's talk. What's been going on and things of that nature. And this has a legitimate impact on the entire company, not just that individual, but kind of like you said. I mean, when people were aware of it, they rallied around that person to, help them along. Whereas, if nobody knew about it, business would have went on as usual. The performance of that person would have continued to decline until they got replaced or something, which wasn't even necessary. And it would have taken time and money to replace that person where all you had to do was talk to them. So
one of the questions that I have based on that point is like, where is I guess where's like the line to be compassionate and caring and, trying to help the person, and just knowing that their performance just it's not helpful at all. Like, because you do want to, be there for someone, but at the
Right.
same time, if it's hurting the company so much, that like, can you, I guess, like, how far can that go on, kind of thing?
Right. So in the book, we actually give leaders a model to follow, and companies a process to follow, and in our training classes as well, which involves, and this will be a little hard to describe without like a whiteboard, but it involves a talent matrix. So if you think about a 9-block talent matrix, or frankly, an organization could use any talent type process that they might have in place. But if you think about it, right, if you've got somebody who is a high performing, high potential, who suddenly their performance declines, there's a reason for that, right?
Mhm.
And you can be a lot more forgiving with that person than somebody who is already a low performer and their performance gets worse, right? And it's you've actually touched on a very interesting question that a lot of leaders struggle with, and we get asked a lot. So when do you can't save everybody, and that's true, right? That underperforming person, you should still ask them and try to understand. But at the end of the day, you might not be able to help that, right? The performance just might be so overwhelmingly poor that there's no other alternative but to unfortunately let the person go. But 9 times out of 10, that's not the case, right? 9 times out of 10, it's somebody who is performing well, and this behavior is a little unusual. And leaders just need to step back, right? So one of the things that has always struck me is, and I fell into this trap early in my career as well, and it really wasn't until I started studying lean leadership that I kind of wrapped my head around this. But a lot of times, especially new leaders, think that their job is to manage is to get the results, right? I'm here to get the results. This metric, this process, this whatever, that's what I get paid for. That's what we're going to do. My company gives me bonuses for dealing with performance issues quickly, right? I get evaluated on that, and high performance teams and hitting my numbers. And that's what we're going to do, right? Well, at the end of the day, you manage metric, and you manage systems, and you manage performance. You lead people. And there's a huge difference, right? And in order to lead people, you really have to care about them. Otherwise, you might have direct reports, but you'll never have followers. You'll never have people who really want to go the extra mile for you. And so it's one of the things that we try to teach in our classes, in our sessions, is leadership is about people. It is about caring, right? There's the old saying, nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. And that's true, right? That is very true. And so there is a point always. One of my personal mantras is people first, mission always. So we have to meet the commitments we made, but we're never going to do it on the backs of our people. And sometimes that means you got to have the awkward, uncomfortable, emotional conversations, which comes with dealing with emotionally traumatized individuals, right?
Absolutely.
But it's the leader's job to go there and to be vulnerable and to create a culture where it's okay for people to raise their hand and say, I am struggling and I need help. That's really the environment that you want to try to create.
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to spotting grief, is it mainly based off of performance? Like, is performance the only way, or a dip in performance the only way that you can spot grief? Because I feel like, like everybody's going through something, but not everybody's going through like grief, I would guess. So it's like, as a leader, like, how do you kind of, sniff this out in your organization in order to go about, some plan of action to help that person cope with it?
Sure. So there are lots of signs. Some of them are subtle, some are not. People who are normally so it's really interesting, because what I'm about to share with you is almost like a double-edged sword, right? It's going to be like, well, but you just told me this and now you're telling me that, right? So someone who is typically when an individual suddenly gets quiet, right? They're normally very participative in meetings, and now they're getting quiet. That can be a sign that something's going on. Emotional flare-ups at work, right? So somebody who's normally pretty even-tempered starts, getting angry with folks, or spouting off in meetings, or just seems more agitated than normal. People late for meetings, missing meetings, calling in, right? Starting to call in at work, not coming in. Obviously, there's signs, there can be signs of depression. You might see people crying in their office. And what we recommend is don't let those, be very aware of the nonverbal communication that's going on with people. And, hey, everybody gets quiet every now and again. But, if it's sort of unusual, ask the person, you doing okay? I've noticed you're a lot quieter in meetings now. Is there something going on? Do you want to talk about anything, or do you need help with anything? Or the flip side is, right, somebody who throws themselves into their work could be a sign of denial, right? So they're just going to plow ahead because they don't want to go home and face whatever the problem is. So I'm just going to work 14 hours a day. And so that's one of those where that seems counterintuitive, right? So that would, right? Most managers, most leaders would be like, wow, Jasmine's here all the time, right? She's awesome, right? In the meantime, Jasmine is hiding behind work. And sooner or later, that's going to catch up with Jasmine, right? Because sooner or later, the emotions just overwhelm. So those are some of the signs that leaders can look for. My brother just had an article published on a blog called Great Leadership, and it's about how can you spot emotional trauma and grieving in a virtual world, right? Because it's one thing when we're seeing each other every day at work, right? Now I'm not seeing you every day. I might see you on a Zoom call, we're exchanging emails, and it's very similar, right? It's very similar. A telltale sign could be if you're in a meeting and somebody turns their video off. That should be a concern to a leader, that he should address or she should address afterwards. Because what might be happening, and actually I'll give you a very cute example of this. Now my brother's 9-year-old son is being schooled from home, right? Because they live in Colorado and they got everything shut down in Colorado. Yeah. They're doing, Zoom. That's his schooling. And his computer kept locking up, and he was getting further and further and further behind, and he was getting frustrated, and he started to cry. And so he turned the video off because he did not want he didn't want his classmates to see him crying. So he went video off, which freaked his teacher out. She was like, "Are you okay, Dominic? Are you there? Are you home alone? Are your parents home?" But it turned out he got overwhelmed, and the emotions kicked in, and he did not want his peers to see him cry on camera. That might be what's going on. If somebody suddenly goes off video, they may be dealing with something that shouldn't be ignored. And it doesn't have to be a pressing, why did you turn off your video, right? If that's how you approach it, for sure, the person's going to come up with some reason other than the truth. But if you approach it from hey, I saw that you went video off during our session today. Just want to make sure everything's okay, because I know things are stressful and there's things going on in your house, as there is with all of us. Just, are you all right? Are things okay? Because if they're not, please know that you can talk to me about it. That's what we try to teach.
So you should do kind of like a soft approach for the grieving employees. So what steps should you take to help them cope with it? If you even should try to help cope.
Right. So in our training sessions, we tell leaders to do we tell them a lot more than that, but there's 3 sort of takeaways in a session like this. One is engage. One is actually adapt your leadership style to help this individual. And the third one is involve the team, because the team typically wants to help, but they don't know how, right? And so it's very, your question is a good one, but it's very situation specific, right? Because different things require different actions. But the big point is engage in the conversation. Doesn't always have to be a soft pedal, right? It doesn't have to be a soft approach. It depends on how aware you are of the situation, right? If someone's, an example in the book, a vice president of international sales calls in the middle of the night and says his son was just killed in a tragic accident and he doesn't know when he'll be back at work. You don't have to ease into that conversation, right? That's a phone call that says, hey, I can't even imagine what you're going through. We're here to help. If you can't talk about it now, that's okay. But gosh, we want to support you. So, is it all right if I schedule a time to talk with you about how we can help you through this? Because I can't even fathom what this is like. So, you can be very upfront in those kinds of situations. In the situations where you're not sure what's going on, but you see signs, then you have to take a little bit softer approach. But at the end of the day, it just comes down to, okay, how can we help this person, right? What help do they need? In my brother's instance, all this person needed was just the ability to say, hey, I'm not going to be at work today, and have him know why, so that he could make arrangements with the rest of the team to pick things up, and they would know that this was going to happen and, hey, we have to do this. Some of it may be adjusting work hours. It might be, it's really limited, frankly. It could be adjusting assignments. It could be adjusting responsibilities. It could be all kinds of things. But what I have found, since most of my career was spent in union environments, is even with a very constrictive union contract, you have ways that you can help people. There's a lot more flexibility than policies and procedures and contract language might lead you to believe, right? But first you have to care, because the easy answer is, oh, well, we have a policy that says you can't do that, right? No, I'm sorry. Our policy is you only get 3 days off for the loss of a child. So you'll have to be back at work.
That's horrible.
Right. So, and while we think that is horrible, right, we're not taking the approach of trying to get every company to change their leave policies. Although as part of our training, we do come in and we'll do an emotional well-being cultural assessment to understand sort of on the scale, where does a company stand from a procedural policy standpoint, right? Do they seem to get it? And they have good flexible working policies. They have extended bereavement leave. They have, whatever the case may be. Do they have the type of policies that support this? But even if you don't, there's an awful lot of flexibility leaders have to give people space to deal with this. And the mere fact that they can talk about it goes a long, long way. Every single interview we did to research the book all ended with the following comments. Whether the person was treated well by their leader or not, right? They all said either, I was so thankful I could talk about this at work because it relieved so much stress and I knew I could go in and talk to my boss, or they said, I wish I would have been able to go in and talk to my boss because it would have relieved a whole lot of stress. And the other thing that every single person said, regardless of how their company treated them, was, but if I worked for a different leader, I don't know if I would have been treated the same way, which just speaks to some leaders get it and they intuitively lead this way. Others don't. But overall, organizations have not set the expectations or put processes in place to make it clear to their leaders how they want their folks to handle emotionally traumatized employees while they're at work. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, it definitely does. So I guess like a piggyback to that question would be like, what things should you like absolutely not say or do when trying to help like the grieving employee? Because I know there has to be something like, why did you even do that?
Right. So one is don't ignore it, right? Don't ignore it. That's not what leaders should do, right? Don't just assume that if I don't say anything, it's just going to get better on its own, because that's likely not the case. Not in the time frame that you'll want it to get better, for sure. Then some other things, and we have a whole chapter in the book on this. Actually, we touch on it in a couple of places. Don't compare your situations. That doesn't work. Grief is not the same for everybody. So just because you had a mother that was diagnosed with cancer doesn't mean that you reacted or it was the same as my mother being diagnosed with cancer. So don't compare. Don't say at least, right? I did a video that's out on our website that rattles through a couple of the just insane things that people say in times like this, right? Like, so a company's own initiatives can cause employees to grieve, right? There's a lot of that going on right now. Companies are trying to get back to pre-COVID profit levels. They're cutting benefits. They're laying people off. They're not calling people back. They're doing all kinds of things that will cause their people to grieve, right? It may appear that their folks are resistant to change, but in reality, they're just traumatized and they are grieving, right? And in that video, somebody who tells somebody that they're being laid off and then says, but unemployment is at the lowest levels they've ever been, so now's a great time to find a job, is not a good thing to say, right? That's not helpful. Sounds helpful. The leader does not mean to be malicious or to be hurtful. He's trying to be positive or she's trying to be positive. But at the end of the day, if you're the person who's now out on the street worried about how you're going to pay your bills and how long it's going to take you to find a job, and I got to update my resume and I don't even know how to go look for a job, in this market anymore, because now we got LinkedIn and Indeed and all these, I'm not a good networker. You have no idea what's going through this person's mind. So to say, well, at least the job on market is, better than it's ever been, so you should be fine. That's not helpful, right? So don't compare, don't say at least. Try not to put the word but in there, right? So I can only imagine. So it's one thing to say, I can't even imagine how you're feeling right now. Stop. You send one message. If you say, I can't even imagine how you're feeling right now, but we have revenue goals we have to hit this month, that's that says you don't really care.
Yeah.
Right. So those are a couple of things. Like I said, there's a chapter of do's and don'ts in our book. So
yeah, I think this is such a good podcast episode. And there's so many takeaways. We got to introduce the book, by the way. You have the book? Yeah. So for any of our
awesome
listeners,
Yep. Thank you for this.
yeah, for any of our listeners or anybody who's watching on YouTube or any other platform, make sure you get the book, especially if you're a leader. Even if you're not a leader, you could, probably, give it to your boss and just suggest that he reads it.
We've had a couple of people do that, by the way.
It's a smart idea because at the end of the day, like, there's been times where I've been led by people. And I wish that I could have made suggestions that I didn't make, that probably would have made not only a bigger difference for me, but would have made a bigger difference for the entire organization. So I always tell my employees, hey, when it comes to a lot of things, you're going to be smarter than I am. So if you see something that's a good idea, please bring it to me. Like, just please do not think I am smarter than I am, because I guarantee you I'm not. But yeah, make sure you pick up the book, The Dying Art of Leadership. Did I get that title right? Yeah, The Dying Art of Leadership. At first when I got it, I'm gonna be honest, it was like, oh yeah, this looks like it'll be a good read eventually. But it's like, now that I hear it from you personally, it's necessary. It's so necessary, because even some of the stuff you said, like, I realized that as a leader myself, sometimes, because I've gone through stuff differently, kind of like what you said, you went through something, but you handled it a lot differently than somebody who went through the same thing. So even if I don't, the words doesn't come out of my mouth like, oh, I went through the same thing or something like that, in my own mind, I have to fight the urge to be insensitive to what they're going through just because I got through it. So it's something important. I mean, if I can make the mistake, I'm pretty sure lots of other people can.
And we've actually just recently had one of our employees, her mom passed away, and it was like kind of unexpected, and we were all like, wow, this is crazy. But I mean, we handled it pretty well. The manager, she did like an excellent job. Like you said, she kind of knew what to do, just like intuitively. So I'm really thankful for that, because if we would have had another person, I'm not sure they would have been the same way.
Yeah,
exactly.
And it's such a blessing.
Exactly.
One thing I was wondering, however, is when it comes to handling the work situation, I realized that I'm the type of person that, depending on what I'm going through, I'll either want to work more or work less. When somebody goes through something, you want one thing I will probably be confused about, and I know I would be confused about it because I got to figure out how to do it for myself half of the time, is there's certain people who will probably ask, oh, I probably need this amount of time off. And I think that's really great. But there's some people who want to work. I was watching this show, and this guy had his younger brother had just been killed. And his boss was trying to get him to not come to work. I
Right.
think it was like the next day or something like that. But he said, I have to work. Like there's nothing else I know to do in this situation. Right. How do you really handle that? Because it's like I could personally think that this person needs time off, but they really want to work. And it's like, that can be in my opinion, that could be like a tricky situation because you want to look out for them. But for some people, maybe working is the best thing that they can do in that situation. So how would you know either way? Or how would you navigate that?
Right. Great question. So we are not trying to, in any way through the book or through our leadership training, we're not trying to make leaders grief counselors, right? So that's not what we're trying to do. And every individual is different, right? And probably in all of the examples that I gave here, I probably left out an important point, which is, when I said adapt your leadership style as one of the 3 tips to leave folks with here today, that's not done in isolation, right? You might have some thoughts that you would approach the person and say, hey, here's what I'm thinking, but this should be collaborative, right? Yeah. So if you think that the employee needs time off, but the employee is saying, no, look, trust me, the best thing I can do is work, then work with that, right? That's okay.
Yeah.
But be really, really, really sensitive to what's going on there. And, if this person's at work, in this instance, I think you said his brother was killed. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Okay. A little different. If it was his son, right, and he's got a wife at home and he's now working 18 hours a day because he can't deal with it, he's probably damaging a relationship at home, right? So think about, at some point offering employee assistance counseling to this individual. Not that the leader would do any counseling, but hey, have you ever thought about, maybe you want to check out, we have this benefit, maybe you want to check that out. But at the end of the day, this only works if the employee is on board with it, right? So to adapt your leadership style, you need to include the employee in that plan, right? Or in that adapting, right? But you should always care. Just because this individual says work is the best thing for him, doesn't mean that you go, oh, okay, sweet, right? So I'll just keep piling things onto you then, because no problem, right? There's thinking is required, right? That's the other part of leadership, is thinking is required. And so, some people will want to work, and that's how they deal with it. Just be very sensitive to what's going on and the rest of the things in their lives, and give them opportunities to talk, and always be concerned. Just always be concerned. Just care, right? Just care.
Yeah. So we went through so much in this podcast episode, but if you had to give one takeaway for the listener to walk away with, what would it be?
Interesting. I think it would be, don't be afraid to engage, right? This is a huge problem, right? Studies have been done that say potentially, and these were done before COVID, right? So potentially 1 in 4 people that show up to work are in some state of grief, right? $75 billion a year just in the US in lost productivity because of it, right? And now with COVID, those numbers could be much larger, right? Because we're dealing with all kinds of things now. So this is a big deal, and there's a few reasons why folks are not good at this, right? One is society in general is not good at dealing with grief, right? How many times have you run into somebody in the grocery store and you pray that they didn't see you because you don't know what to say to them, and you hope that you don't have to talk to them, right? The same is true in organizations. One of the things that astounded us as we did our research for the book is there are no other books out there that talk about this. There are no other leadership programs. This is not taught in any business school anywhere, right? So leaders are not taught this. And then organizations just don't have processes to deal with it. So engage, right? It's going to be awkward. It's going to be emotional. It's going to be uncomfortable. That's all okay, right? That's all okay. Because at the end of the day, people need to know you care about them, right?
Yeah.
And so don't ignore it, engage. That would be the big takeaway, right?
Yeah.
And then buy the book and don't say the wrong thing.
Absolutely. Do not say the wrong thing. That's the exact time you don't want to screw that up. So you're on the Abundant Culture podcast, and we feel the need to ask this question to everybody who comes on because
Sure.
we get very unique answers and interesting answers. And the question is whether it be in your personal life, in your professional life, or in your spiritual life, how do you like to spread abundance to others?
So the short answer is by giving back, right? Have either of you ever read the poem The Dash?
No, I have not.
When we're done, you should search that. So it's a really cool poem about a person strolling through a graveyard looking at tombstones, and he's reading all of the things on the tombstone. Loving father, loving husband, whatever, born, died. And it begins to dawn on him that the most important thing on the tombstone is the little dash between the date of birth and the date of death. And that everyone should live their life to make that dash matter, because that dash represents what you did when you were here.
Wow.
And so, yeah, Jasmine, I had the exact same response when I read the poem. And it has changed the way I live my life, because I want the dash in my story to matter, right?
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean, hey, look at me, right? The way you make the dash matter is you help other people, right? Be it through grief or through finding a job or through whatever it is, right? Giving a hand up, right? Just it's really helping others. I truly believe that's our purpose for being here, right? Is to help each other.
Yeah.
And so whatever the situation is, and I'm fortunate to be married to someone who is actually better at this than I am. So that's how we live our lives. And frankly, that's behind the book and our leadership training, right? We didn't do this to become a best-selling author or to make millions. That was really never something my brother and I talked about. What we said was, wow, we could make a difference here. We think there's an opportunity here to help people, leaders and those who are traumatized, deal with this. So that's the long answer to the question.
Love it.
And that's a beautiful way to think about it, helping others. Because at the end of the day, I like the people that I've met that help the most people, they have something to be grateful about.
Right.
And they have a sense of joy that I don't believe you can get from anything else outside of helping other people. So that's amazing that you live your life by that. And I think this book is a testament to that, because I mean, if you could put this in the hands of just 1,000 people and 1,000 people use it, I believe those 1,000 people can impact 10,000 people, and those 10,000 people can impact 100,000.
Right.
And I feel like it can really change the culture of companies, because let's be honest, there's times where corporate America is ruthless.
Yep.
And I believe that there's, capitalism is great, but we have a lot of fixing that we can do. There's a lot of things that we can improve on. And I feel like that area of helping employees or anybody manage grief is one of those areas. So if somebody wants to work with you or your team and just really see what you guys are up to, what is the best way for them to get in contact with you guys?
Sure. So probably the best way is through our website at griefleaders.com. There's a contact us section, and there's some forms they can fill out to either engage us or just to have a complimentary conversation about things that are going on or questions they might have. So that would be the best way. They can also order the book through that site. or they can follow us on LinkedIn and certainly can message us there as well. They can either follow myself or my brother Guy on LinkedIn, and those would be the two best ways to get a hold of us.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much, Anthony, for this wonderful podcast episode. This was very, very insightful. And I think a ton of people are going to learn how to become a better leader just by listening to this episode alone. So we thank you so much for coming onto the podcast.
Absolutely, my pleasure. I hope you're right, because the only measure of success we have is how many people we help. So thank you so much for having us on, and let me tell the story.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks.
So that's all we have for today, folks. I hope you got as much value out of this as we did. Keep in mind, the only way we can improve is through constructive feedback. So remember to rate and review this episode. Also, you are not the only person that needs to know this super valuable information. So be sure to subscribe and share as well. Stay tuned for the next episode. And remember to always spread abundance. Peace.